wanted to thank you for the opportunity to talk this morning, this afternoon, depending upon your time zone. And I have 15 minutes to review what we call at the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child Ingredients for Healthy Brain Development and the core story of brain and child development. I just want to note that for videos and working papers, there's lots of materials that are free and downloadable at this website that you'll be able to access at the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard that oversees the National Council. So there's a core concept that we have embraced now for 10 years about the foundations of prosperity and sustainability for any community, and that begins early in childhood. So this generates competency in adulthood, responsible citizenship, economic productivity, strong communities, and a just and fair society, which we think is embraceable by everybody. The idea then is to focus on why early is so important. And I think that for years the public has thought about child development as being a bit of a black box where a number of different ingredients, hard to understand, like fate and free will and parents and genes and environment, kind of feed into this box, and then you either get out on the other side a successful or an unsuccessful child. But we know now that child development is linked to brain development, and brain development is not a passive activity, but rather it's very active, and I'm going to go through some of the key components of that. Child development is the foundation for prosperous communities. I've already told you that. Brains and child development skills are built over time from the bottom up. So basic skills form the foundation for the ability to perform more complex skills. You can think about it in terms of early skills, getting a child ready for being able to take on the challenges of social, emotional, and cognitive aspects of what they're going to encounter in the world and when they start school. So this occurs in a stepwise fashion, just like designing and implementing the building of a house. Genes and experience together build brains, so it's not just what we inherit from mom or dad, but experiences that the child has, and even before birth, work together to build brains. And after birth, we call this experiential, these interactions, what we call serve and return, where there's an expectancy of the infant and the toddler and the child to interact with important individuals in their world, primary caregivers, siblings, friends, members of the community. Cognitive, social, and emotional development are inextricably intertwined. You can't do one or develop one without the other. So programs that focus only on education and cognition are really not embracing the core principles of neuroscience, where these circuits that underlie cognitive functions and social and emotional functions develop together in a related way. And I'll show you why in a minute. We know that adverse experiences, what we call toxic stress, can damage brain architecture, and that can create problems for a lifetime. And for many functions, the brain's capacity for change decreases over time. This is about what economists talk about in terms of the cost-effectiveness factor. Not all functions are impacted equally in terms of the ability to change or not change, but there's a core principle. The longer you wait, the more difficult it is to be able to change. And think about your own life in which you try to learn a different language as an adult, or try to take on some new hobby as an adult, and how it would have been if you were able to take it on as a child. So there are four numbers that I'd like you to remember: 700 per second, 18 months, 90 to 100%, and 3-to-1 odds. And I'm going to tell you what they are connected to in terms of brain and child development. So 700 per second is the remarkable number of nerve connections, or what we call synapses, that are made during the period from the last trimester of pregnancy through 2 to 3 years of age. And in these pictures that I'm going to show you in sequence, you can see the growth of nerve cells in the part of the brain called the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for the more complex functions that we all are able to perform over time. And you can see this remarkable growth, which is a reflection of the increase in connections. And if you snap your fingers, 700 nerve connections a second, that's how fast they're formed over time. And look what happens between newborn and 2 years. So that's why we talk about early being so important, because the amount of growth that is in part due to genetics, but in large part due to experiences that are occurring during this period of time, during infancy and into toddlerhood, are driving this process of making these remarkable connections. Now, we end up making more connections than we end up having to use, and we have a term in neuroscience called use it or lose it, and so the strongest connections that are strengthened through experiences are going to be stabilized, and those that are not used are going to be lost. And you can see this in the sequence of images, so that by the time an individual is a teenager, they've essentially pruned away, like you would in an overgrown garden. We prune away about half of the connections that we actually made. So we overproduce connections, and then experience is the sculptor that sculpts those connections that we want to maintain. Now, the important thing about brain development is that it depends upon those experiences, but it doesn't filter good experiences out only and keep those and ignore bad experiences. So bad experiences like toxic stress, which I'll talk about in a minute, are just as powerful in driving this process as positive experiences. So keep in mind, development's not a blank slate, and skill begets skill. So what do we mean by that? Let me go back one. So the first circuits that form, the first connections that form, are those that underlie our sensory capabilities like vision and hearing and touch, and they develop very early. They're already present by the time of birth, because that's how an infant takes in information, gathers those experiences in their world. They have to be able to sense what's going on in their world. So sensory pathways develop very, very early and are critically important for what comes next. Language, which is part of bringing together information that an infant hears with what they see in terms of how the lips move and how somebody who's talking to them moves, and then identifying those sounds and with specific objects, which is how language is incorporated. You can see that that process begins a little later than sensory pathway development. It takes a little bit longer to develop. And then finally, higher cognitive functions, I'll talk about those in a minute, they can take through teenage years to develop, particularly parts of the brain that we call the frontal lobe, which are take a very long time to develop, all of which depends upon experiences that a child and pre-adolescent and adolescent have. So this idea of interaction and experience driving brain development continues through the teenage years. Now, 18 months is a metric that we've identified in research that is sort of a demonstration of how important experiences and this idea of serve and return, this interaction between child and primary caregiver or other important members of their life. And I use language as an illustration. So this is work that's been replicated over and over again, that there's a high correlation between the number of words that an infant and toddler hear and the level of language complexity that they're able to attain. It's directly related. And if you look at this chart, in the first 16 months, there's virtually no difference if you, in the study where they group between children who were in families of parents on public assistance, working class parents who may or may not have had a high school education, and then college educated parents. And the 18-month number comes from the fact that about that time you see this bifurcation, this split between the three groups in which the children, the toddlers who are in the college-educated families, begin to accelerate in terms of their accumulating vocabulary. And by the time they get to 3 years of age, there's literally a twofold difference in the number of words in the vocabulary of a 3-year-old in a family in which the parents are college-educated compared to the other group. So this kind of study demonstrates the importance of interactions and positive experiences and how much the brain depends upon those experiences to develop skills. Now, in addition to those cognitive functions, I mentioned before that social, emotional, and cognitive skills are built over time, and they're interconnected. They're related to each other. We call this executive function. And what's interesting about this is that the same circuits, and you can see this complex diagram of the human brain, you can see structures in pink and green and blue. Those are the circuits, the brain structures that are involved in controlling our emotions, our anxiety, and our fears. And they also happen to be, I just changed the slide, you may not have noticed. Let me go back. You can see the brain architecture of anxiety and fear in the title. And now you see the brain architecture of memory and learning. They're the same circuits. And so when we have experiences that damage those brain areas that are involved in emotion and anxiety and fear, they're also going to impact the same circuits that are involved in memory and learning, which is why these are fundamentally linked to each other and so important. Now my computer wheel is spinning. I'm not able, here we go. I'm trying to change the slide. There's a bit of, here we go. So, I've lost my ability to change slides up here. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
One moment.
The forward and back arrow vanished from the top of my screen.
One moment.
Okay. Here we go. So part of these complex skills that we take on in terms of executive function, if you think about executive function, it's like the job that an air traffic controller has to do. They have to remember all sorts of facts, all sorts of maps in their head. They have to be able to tell planes when to land and when not to land. They have to keep all sorts of information stored in their memory bank. They have to remain emotionally calm while they're making all these split-second decisions, and that's essentially what our executive function does for us as individuals. And so emotional regulation is an important part of developing executive function skills, but it's challenging because anxiety and fear, emotional regulation, are actually a normal part of our repertoire that we have. It's essential to facilitate the detection of danger in the environment. So how do we develop a healthy way of controlling our fears and anxieties that will allow us in appropriate circumstances to respond to danger, but in other circumstances not overreact and be able to control ourselves? Some of it is through experience. So for example, in the 3 levels of stress experience that we talked about, positive stress, those are changes that occur when we're challenged, perhaps emotionally, like for example, as a first or second grader standing up in front of a classroom, we have brief increases in heart rate, mild elevation in stress hormone levels. We get used to performing under stressful conditions, but we have supportive relationships that help buffer those responses, and we learn how to deal with those. Tolerable stress, serious temporary stress responses, can be damaging over the long term. A loss of a loved one, moving around a lot, other sorts of examples, natural disasters. In the absence of being buffered by supportive relationships, that tolerable stress can turn into what we call toxic stress, which is prolonged activation of stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships. Now, in the United States, this is from Department of Health and Human Services in 2010, many people are surprised to learn that the neglect is the most prevalent form of what we would term toxic stress or child maltreatment. The absence of interaction is just as powerful in a negative way on brain and child development as what we typically think about, which is child abuse and other sorts of maltreatment. These toxic stress experiences actually do damage brain architecture, and this is just a set of images up here to show you. If you look at this, this is what a normal brain cell looks like, and this is what a brain cell looks like with early toxic experiences. The number of those nerve connections actually is reduced substantially. Now, 90 to 100%. If you look at children, if you look at adults, if you look at children who have had 6 or 7 or more adverse childhood experiences and ask what their development looks like, 90 to 100% of them will have developmental delay, most of them ending up in special needs classes. And when I talk to business leaders and policymakers about this, this immediately sets off a light bulb because this is money. The cost in California, for example, of a child in a special needs class compared to a typical developing class is about $55,000 versus $9,000. So adverse experiences early over and over again can have major effects, not just in the long term, but in the short term as well. If you look at long-term issues, if you look at individuals in the general population, they have about a 18-20% risk of developing depression. If they're maltreated as a child, developing depression goes up to about 35%. If they've experienced depression and they were maltreated as a child, the odds of them having coronary artery disease goes up about 3 times compared to the control group. So not only is brain development and these skills that are mediated by the brain affected, but general health, physical health, increased risk for cardiovascular disease as adults, increased risk for cancer, increased risk for immune disorders, all of which have been now documented by looking at the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And the same is true when we look at adult reported use of alcohol or illicit drugs. The numbers go up dramatically, as you can see in these graphs, from 0 to 4 and above, where it changes the risk very, very dramatically. So I'm almost finished. I have about another minute. What is neuroscience telling us? Well, one thing I already told you is that normal brain plasticity, or the ability to change through experience, decreases over time. That's what this red line is showing you. So it's not that we can't change later, it just takes a lot more effort, a lot more what we call physiological effort to get any kind of a change. And the question is whether the changes will actually be as robust as if we try to intervene early on when the brain is most malleable. So it's going to cost more for society to wait until essentially the damage has been done, and it's a real struggle to figure out the programs later on that really are going to be both cost-effective and effective. Economists such as Jim Heckman have generated lots of data showing that when you look at return on investment from a policymaker and business leader's perspective, there's about a 7-to-1 return with investments early on in early and preschool programs compared to later where the return on investment is much lower. So thinking broadly about children's environment of relationships, which I've emphasized, plan from pregnancy and look beyond education and healthcare. Social emotional development is connected to cognitive development and education readiness. Invest in development and retention of a skilled workforce in early childhood and public education. We know how important skilled workforce is. We don't want a revolving door in our programs. We want highly skilled individuals, which cost a little bit more up front but generate much more effective programs later on. And make sure vulnerable children have access to stable, supportive relationships with adults as early as consistently as possible. I can't overemphasize that. And so I think I included two programs that many of you have heard about, the Nurse-Family Partnership that's been investigated over and over again. When you look at the return on investment for the high-risk group, there's about a 6-to-1 return on investment compared to the full sample, which is about 3-to-1. And then studies done by Phil Fisher, who's on our council, has shown that an integrated approach to therapeutic foster care, both working with families completely, including the adults and the child, has a profound benefit in terms of reducing the movement of children and generating the probability of a more stable placement. So my argument is that from a policy perspective, invest early, reduces special needs populations, increases what I've talked about before in terms of learning-ready children who are emotionally sound and have great executive function, and increases the importance of human capital. And for all policymakers, I argue that it's patriotic. Thanks very much.
Okay, I believe Anita Fine is next. Fine-Day, I'm sorry.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anita Fine-Day, and I'm currently the Managing Director of the Indian Child Welfare Program here at Casey Family Programs in Seattle. And formerly, I worked as the Chief Judge for my tribe, the White Earth Tribal Nation in northwest Minnesota, and I did that job for 14 years. I'm just going to say a quick word about Casey Family Programs. I won't go read all of these slides. They're here if you want more information about Casey. I just want to say that Casey Family Programs is a foundation working to serve the needs of children in foster care and ultimately to reduce the number of children in foster care. We assist states and tribes in developing programs that improve the lives of children in foster care, and we ultimately hope to reduce the need for foster care for children. The Indian Child Welfare Program works with tribes in 12 states and works with a variety of national partners. Casey has a 2020 goal, which is a very ambitious goal of reducing the number of children in foster care by 50% by the year 2020. One of our important national partners is the National Center for State Legislatures, and I am new to this work. I understand that today's webinar builds on an initial meeting that took place in June of 2011, and we just followed up with that with a meeting in Los Angeles. And I just want to make sure that we thank Representative John McCoy from Washington State for his leadership over the past years, and we're very grateful to Senator Auger for his leadership as the incoming chair of this group. I'm going to give some context, some history. It's important to have this context to understand where we are today as far as Indian children in out-of-home placement. Just a reminder, we all know this, but I think it's important to remember that before the arrival of Europeans, tribes had very vibrant and cohesive cultures. They had hundreds of distinct languages, highly developed agriculture, religious traditions, and most importantly for our purposes here today, they had a very rich, comprehensive, and successful child-rearing practices and traditions. This photo is just an example of one of those really strong tribal child-rearing traditions. From the time of European contact, we know that tribes were dealt a number of really devastating blows. Perhaps one of the most damaging impact on tribal people was exposure to infectious diseases, especially smallpox, and this led to huge loss of life, and many tribes were completely wiped out due to infectious diseases. The tribes that remained were pushed westward, both by military force and by treaties. And we know some of the historical events that occurred. For example, the Cherokee walked what we now call the Trail of Tears. They walked from the Carolinas to what is now Oklahoma, and during that walk, many people died. The Navajo people, many of them were imprisoned at Fort Sumner in Arizona, and many Navajo people died during that incarceration period. But still, large populations of Indian people endured and clung to their traditional ways of life. And this photo is another example of strong tribal child rearing traditions that endured despite times of sometimes overwhelming circumstances. Some of current recent research by Geary and Day talk about attempts to undermine tribal sovereignty and destroy tribal culture and the forced assimilation of American Indian people, that all of this was often masked in the language and practice of child welfare. And perhaps one of the most damaging child welfare practices that was an official federal policy beginning in the 1800s was the federal policy of forcibly placing Indian children in boarding schools long distances from home. This photo is a photo from the Haskell boarding school, and you see the sign called the Haskell Babies. And the text from this photograph, you can't see it, but states that that this photo was taken every year at Haskell and showed the 3- and 4-year-old children who were placed in Haskell that year. So we have 3- and 4-year-olds placed in boarding schools starting in the 1800s. The next photo is, this is of an Apache, a group of Apache students. And there are literally hundreds of these photographs, of before and after photographs. The directors of boarding schools took hundreds of these photos to document what they viewed as success. So this is the before photo. And then this is the photo of the same group of students 4 months later. And when I think of Dr. Levitt's presentation, when he talked about stress and emotion, anxiety, and fear, if you look at these children who have been stripped of everything that they knew, they are a long distance from their family, so they're having no supportive relationships with their family unless they happen to have a sibling placed in the boarding school with them. Their clothing has been replaced with military-style uniforms. Their hair has been cut. And culturally, for many tribes, this was a very shocking thing to do. Many tribes do not believe in cutting their hair except for certain ceremonial purposes. So that would have been probably a very shocking thing to happen to these children. And they were prohibited from speaking their language. Probably most of these kids spoke largely their tribal language. So at the boarding schools, tribal languages were prohibited, and only English was allowed to be spoken. So the children were at these schools. Some of them did not go home during the summertime because the family did not have the means to transport them back. They were responsible for doing that. So oftentimes children remained at these boarding schools for many years. The boarding school era, I think it's important to remember that this was official federal policy, that these schools were federally funded and that attendance was compulsory. And there was a recent article which had a photograph of some small handcuffs for children that were used, and I haven't had time to incorporate that into this, but if you look at the Indian Country Today newspaper within the past week, there's a photograph of some tiny handcuffs that were used to take children to boarding schools when they were not cooperative. And as I mentioned before, children as young as 3 years old were taken to the boarding schools. Another really sad fact is that there was a 50% mortality rate in these boarding schools due, again, to many diseases that were carried by children coming from all over the country. And I think it's important to realize that boarding schools impacted literally every Indian tribe. And every family that I know has stories about family members who were placed in boarding schools. This is a photograph of Haskell Boarding School. This was the one of the largest. There were more than 30 boarding schools nationally, but you can see that there are hundreds of children, and this boarding school operated for more than 80 years. So we know that thousands of Indian children went through these boarding schools, and I think that this is an example of what Dr. Levitt described as toxic stress, the lack of supportive relationships for these children in these foreign environments. Well, a report was sanctioned by Congress, and that report, called the Miriam Report, came out in 1928. And the report documents the fact that even though the boarding schools were federally funded, and the goal was to educate Indian children, the Miriam Report found, in fact, that children were not being taught to read and write. They were being taught they were poorly educated, they were overworked, and they were being taught to be maids and to do laundry, really to function at the lowest rungs of society. So the Indian boarding schools were phased out as a result of the Miriam Report in 1928. In 1958, the Children's Bureau started the Indian Adoption Project and actually worked with the Child Welfare League of America and to find adoptive homes for Indian children. And these were, the goal here was to take Indian children and have them adopted out to non-Indian homes. The Child Welfare League, to their credit, years later did apologize for this, participating in this project that was really genocide, had a goal of genocide of Indian tribes. It was in effect for 9 years, and there was a successor to that project, which was also federally funded. So this went on for a long time, and it had a deep impact. And today, there are still large numbers of Indian children being adopted out of Indian
Ms. Finde,
culture. Yes.
Ms. Finde, just to interrupt briefly, the Montana delegation, and there's 8 of us here, we have to be on the floors of our respective chambers in about 10 minutes. So I really want to make sure that we're allowing you to sort of wrap up, but also I know we have some questions, so I just wanted to give you a heads up. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So that is the backdrop. And against that backdrop, in the 1960s, Indian people began complaining about these federal policies. Congressional hearings were held, and ultimately the Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted in 1978. So today, we know that tribes are beginning to use some of their own cultural practices. One of the things that we know from working with tribes, one of the things that we hear across Indian country is it is not culturally appropriate for tribes to terminate parental rights. Many tribes do not believe that this is appropriate. Today, we have large disproportionality of American Indian children in out-of-home placement. And I won't go through, I did not include all of the slides here. Since we have Montana on the line, and I know that we have Oklahoma on the line, I'll give you a couple of numbers. We know that roughly, I think according to the last census, the Indian population in the state of Montana is about 6.4%. And we also know that according to federal data that's reported to the Children's Bureau, 22% of the children in foster care in Montana are American Indian. And we know that that number is probably low because children who are in foster care as a result of tribal court orders are not reported for the most part, so not included in that federal data. We know that their poverty plays a big role, and I have 2 maps to show you. This map shows the number of American Indian Alaska Native children in out-of-home care. And so you see the dark green is more than 10% of American Indian children are in foster care. And this map shows the number of American Indian children living in poverty. And in those dark green states, the number of American Indian children living in poverty is between 35 and 51%. The other thing that we know about American Indian children in foster care is that there is a higher rate of infants and young children in foster care who are American Indian. So if you look at this chart, the green line is American Indian children in foster care, and you can see that between 20 and 25% of Indian children in foster care are age up to age 5. You can see that there's a disproportionality, and it doesn't even out until about age 6. So larger numbers of children in that crucial brain development age are in foster care. And a good way to think about this is about nation building. The building of Native nations needs healthy, culturally based members and children in out-of-home placement, especially non-Indian out-of-home placement, will not be able to participate fully in their tribes. This slide shows good news that there is a reduction overall in the number of children in foster care. And one note about a case that you probably are going to be hearing a lot more of. It's deemed the Baby Veronica case. It has been taken for review by the United States Supreme Court, and we're all very concerned about what may happen to the Indian Child Welfare Act when the Supreme Court makes its decision. So I will stop there.
Well, once again, thank you, Ms. Feinday. We certainly appreciate the information. Dr. Levitt, Also a great presentation. I would hope that NCSL staff are able to secure these PowerPoints and offer them out to our members by way of email if possible. As chair of the National Caucus of Native American State Legislators, I want to thank everyone for their participation. There are 8 legislators here in Montana participating on the phone. I know our good friend, Representative Anastasia Pittman of Oklahoma is also on the phone. She's chair of the Health Committee. It makes sense to me that we have a follow-up discussion. I know Representative Pease Lopez of Montana recently attended a conference with Casey Foundation regarding this important work. So I would certainly, at some point in the very near future, appreciate for Representative Pittman and Representative Pease Lopez to pull together a follow-up discussion on this effort. As we all know, protecting the health and well-being of our children in Indian country for Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian is always a top priority for all of us. The information we gain through these meetings, like this one, will help our caucus as we consider our committee work in draft resolutions. It also influences us as individual legislators as we create and reform our laws in our respective states. We, on behalf of the National Caucus of Native American State Legislators, are certainly honored to be a part of this work with Casey Family Programs and the National Conference of State Legislators. So I do want to thank our staff person, Shelley McDonald, and of course Irene Kalanabe for their work and for considering us a part of this effort. I do know there probably are questions, but the Montana delegation must break away at this point to meet our floor times. Otherwise, we're going to buy donuts for the entire chamber, and we certainly don't want to do that. But thank you. If possible, I'm going to turn it over to Shelley McDonald at this point.
Thank you, Senator Rozier. Now it's time for us to open it up for questions. If there are any members out there who'd like to ask Dr. Levitt or Judge Feinday about their work.
Thank you. If you have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. If at any time your question has been answered, you can remove yourself from the queue by pressing 1. If you're using a speakerphone, we ask that you pick up your handset while posing your question to provide a favorable sound quality. You may also submit your questions in the chat box at the lower right hand of your screen. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. We have a question from Anastasia Pittman. Please ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I'm so pleased. You can't imagine how I'm screaming in my office that we are following up on this very important information. I do have several questions, and I do want to be respectful of the time that we have allotted for our webinar, so I will be sending some follow-up questions as well. But Shelley, my first question to our staff is to hone in a deadline for resolutions so that as we get our questions answered here today, we can start framing those results from these questions into resolutions that we can send out.
Yes, Representative. We're working on those with the chair right now and should have something for your review.
Perfect.
We can work on that offline. But thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. And for Dr. Levitt, if he's still with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes. I want to know what kinds of programs work because Oklahoma has such a unique, diverse group of Native Americans. We have 39 federally recognized tribes, and so to be able to have this information available, we're getting ready to start 2 meetings per month with our Native American caucus here. We have 22 members in our Native American caucus. So I want to give them an overview of the information that's been presented and maybe possibly invite you to Oklahoma for both of our presenters, but I just want to know what programs work because we want to know what that means for some of the current intervention programs and services that we have in Oklahoma to make sure they're up to par.
So, you know, there's the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard has a second group that they interact with at the national level called the National Forum, and the National Forum is actually made up of researchers both in economics and in intervention science and other areas to evaluate programs. And the way they've evaluated the programs is to examine the data to say, are these programs really effective? Are these well-controlled studies, et cetera? Because as you know, the most effective way of getting programs implemented and the dollars needed is to be able to demonstrate a research validated program. So I think what we know is that there are some common ingredients that work well. So it's pretty clear from David Old's program, the Nurse Family Partnership programs, that those have been implemented in a number of different areas. The subject populations of families that have been looked at and the impact has been, the numbers are large, and there's several things. One is that starting really early, that is during pregnancy, for those who are at greatest risk, typically single moms, and they typically are young. So starting early, it's not just about the health of the mom and the health of the baby, the fetus developing, but it's also educating the mom about what's going to come and providing that kind of support. The other common ingredient that's very clear is the quality of the people who are administering the program. So a number of programs have tried to copy those with individuals who are not trained or as skilled, and when you look at the outcomes are not nearly as good. The evaluation of studies for early childhood have demonstrated that while IQ may not be affected, and that's what a lot of people focused on, if you look at things like lowering incarceration rates, high school graduation rates, annual salary over a lifetime, that early programs that implemented high qualified preschool teachers, et cetera, have shown over and over again to be effective. The foster care program that I mentioned that Phil Fisher has been doing over the years and is continuing to grow is what I would call multi-dimensional, kind of like the home visitation. But in this case, it's focusing on the child as well as families, as well as adults that are involved in the child's life. And that's another common ingredient, that whatever the program is, taking a multi-dimensional approach, not just focusing on the child, is really critical, because the adults are going to be doing the experience and the interactions with the child, and they need to have that skill set to know what to do and what not to do. I would say the last thing is that Jack Shonkoff, who's head of the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, is now deeply involved in a new effort called Frontiers in Innovation, which is to develop new kinds of programs and not just try to repeat the same old programs. And so the center has, if you go to their website, everything that I've just said and what I talked about is available. My PowerPoint's available, of course, but some of the evaluation science that's been done is also available for you to download and to relate to your legislative partners to sort of talk about the kinds of things that we know work and can be implemented.
Perfect. I will also ask Shelley if we can coordinate a continual conference call so that Dr. Levitt, when we have our Native American Caucus meetings, that you may be available for those particular dates and times to be on the conference as we share this information with our caucus.
Yeah, I can try my best.
Okay, we'll keep you abreast. We'll keep you abreast of those dates and times. Is Dr. Finday still on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you so very much. And I'm going to ask you just one question. I'll try to wrap it up because I want other people to be able to ask a question. So it's my honor to have you online, and I certainly thank our staff for making sure that we followed up on this important information. So my concern is I want to find out how many children that Native American children in Indian country that I have in foster care. I don't know that we track them. I don't know what questions I need to ask to find that information out.
Well, the latest information that I have, and I'll just tell you the quick and dirty numbers. The American Indian population in Oklahoma is, according to this latest census, is 8.9% of the state's population is Indian. And from 2005 to 2011, the number of Indian kids in care were 26 to 29% of the kids in care in Oklahoma were Indian. So about at least 3 times what it should have been. If there was a proportionality. So so there is disproportionality in Oklahoma.
Perfect. Okay. Well, and I would certainly extend the same invitation to you as Dr. Levitt. We have 2 meetings per month, beginning in February until May. So we will send you those dates. I'll give those dates and times to Shelley to see which ones you would be available for to share this information with our Oklahoma delegation, our Native American delegation.
And would be happy to do that. And I have one staff member who is assigned to Oklahoma who's from Oklahoma, so is a wealth of information.
Wonderful. Now, are they placed in Oklahoma? Are they here?
He works out of Denver, but he is there regularly.
Okay. Well, then we'll coordinate with him to see if he can do the live presentation as well as have you on the line. That would be great. That would be great. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll sign out so someone else can ask a question. Thank you.
We have no other questions at this time.
Okay, this is Nina Williams-Mbang in the Children and Families Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I just want to thank both of you, Judge Finday and Dr. Levitt, as well as all the folks on the line from Oklahoma and the Montana delegation. This has been great, interesting, and I'll be very happy to work with Shelley and all of you to coordinate the information and help coordinate future webinars and other information that we can get out to you to continue to work on this very, very important topic. Thank you again.
Thank you. This concludes today's teleconference. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have a great day.